I just got back from this amazing trip, and I want to talk about the legibility of games. How legible, how readable, how understandable games are from a distance, and how we rely on real life stuff to make our games more legible. So I just got back from this trip, and I was in. I had to go to Amsterdam for work. Amsterdam was awesome. I spent a few days afterwards just kind of wandering around some smaller places in Belgium, Ghent and Antwerp, and then a little bit of time in Paris. And it was just this incredible trip to wander around these very old cities, much like the game that I'm working on right now. So I was there just for vacation, and it was awesome. And we'll talk in the later part of this episode, maybe about, if I have time, about like specific things that really stood out to me that were really, really cool there. But it kind of brought back this question to me, which is why games, board games specifically, but also video games and other stuff, have such a consistent and time tested pattern of going back to this era of like medieval Europe or like Renaissance Europe. I'm looking even just at my shelf, and it's like Castle Panic and Dominion and Catan and even to some extent Splendor. And I look back at this and I'm like, so many of the games that we love go back so consistently to this era of like farmers, knights, castles, cathedrals. And I've wondered, like, why is that? And when I was in my early days of designing stuff, I would even resist it because I was like, I don't know, this just seems like it's what everyone else is doing. I don't want to throw just a like standard kind of medieval theme on this game. It just doesn't seem that interesting. It doesn't feel that inspired to me. But I've always wondered, like, why do people constantly go back to it? And as I wandered around these places and actually felt like a little kid, like walking into these castles, like feeling like I was in Princess Bride or Monty Python or whatever, feeling like I was in one of these games, having this immersive experience of being in these really cool old cathedrals, old castles, I actually started to think that maybe a big part of it is about legibility, the ability to kind of like read something easily and even read it at a distance. So let me give an example from an existing game that I already made. And from the card game I made, Colossi, there's these three card types. There's water and fire and electricity. And this is a really common pattern that you can recognize from tons of games, even like Pokemon and stuff, right? The water counters the fire. Water puts out fire and makes this card less valuable, but also water makes electricity more powerful, right? And so this is a relationship that you just get from real life. And even as you look from a distance, you can just see this like bright blue, bright orange, bright yellow, and understand intuitively the relationship between these things. You play a water card, you have a sense of what it's going to do, and in fact, it does it, right? This is really important in games to give players kind of an intuitive, real life grounding of some kind to make it easier for them to read your game, to make your game more legible to them, even legible from a distance. Now, this could have been anything. When I first came up with the rules of this game, it could have been, whatever. I didn't even yet have a theme. The functionally, originally, the only relationship between those cards was like this card type makes this other card type more valuable and this other card type less valuable, right? Could have been anything. But I intentionally chose to do something that was kind of grounded in the real world because that's one less thing that the player has to understand and learn. And it's one more thing that maybe grounds the player in something that feels immersive and feels real. You can contrast this with, I don't know, if you play there's a bunch of sci-fi games that work really well and people really get it. But I played something, I think of something like Destiny. I used to play that video game for a while. And when you get into it, it's this kind of like far future sci-fi thing. And there's a huge learning curve where you have to just learn the language and materials of this world. They're like, well, if you want to upgrade this weapon, you need like an ascendant shard and spin metal. And you have to like go farm that from certain places that have it and don't farm it from other places that don't have it. And it's just like a whole bunch of extra cognitive load that you're putting on the player and a huge barrier to entry for them to even understand the world that they're operating in. And for a certain type of player, that's like totally fine and that's actually appealing. They like to learn that kind of thing. But I actually think just for my own games, which are a bit more casual, it's like it's really important to give the player something to latch onto that's grounded in real life. So the reason why I think my theory, sure there's a lot of good theories out there, and you can let me know in the comments what you think. But my current theory about why it is so appealing to make games that are in this kind of ancient, or not ancient, medieval or Renaissance European era is that it's an incredibly legible time in human history, maybe the most recent time in human history when the world was legible from a distance. Which buildings matter? Well, the tall ones, right? The cathedral, the one that's in the center of the city, right? Where is commerce happening? Well, it's happening on the river. Well, who's the person who is the merchant who sells stuff? It's the guy with a big kind of like wagon full of stuff, right? Who's like, who has money and who has power? It's like, well, the people with the robes and not the peasants who are wearing like brown, torn rags, right? Who's the farmer? It's like, well, the guy with the big sack of grain and the rake, right? It's like one of my favorite podcasters, Merlin Mann, likes to talk about like when people had like Richard Scarry jobs. Richard Scarry being the like old children's illustrator who would draw these like kind of idealistic little kind of town squares where it's like, oh, there's the plumber who looks like a plumber and a teacher who's carrying a book and an apple, and everybody just has a job that you can kind of see immediately from a distance and go, I get what they do, I get what the role is here. And I think that that's kind of the mindset you want players in when they play your game, because then they're able to jump straight into the gameplay in a kind of immersive and familiar way. And this is a really powerful thing. And I found myself as I walked around these real castles and was looking at like swords, you know, from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and looking at like relics and these cool old cathedrals. I was like, right, this is, I get what this world is. I get what the power dynamics are here. And that makes it a really appealing place to say, okay, well, and what if there was like magic and dragons also? And people get immediately what that is. And I think that that's such a big part of why it works really well for games, is because people can immediately kind of like understand what this world is, what their role is in it, how it works in a general sense, that then they can latch onto the actual gameplay. Some of the really specific things that I loved and kind of found inspiring over there. One of them was, I just mentioned like finding like swords, relics, things like that. I was thinking about like in my game, I'm going to need to like the things that the wanderers find in the old ancient city are all relics, right? They need to find stuff. And so walking through these museums actually caused me to really think about like, well, what are they finding? You know, like they have to find real objects. And so everything in my game that's like an action that a wanderer takes is a relic that they found somewhere. And so it made me start thinking about like, oh, interesting. I need to represent that with real stuff, like whether it's like a scroll or a book or an icon from an old church. My microphone will not stop sagging. Whether it's an incense burner from a church, whether it's a clay pot. It just made me think about like, oh, interesting. What are the real things that people actually have that we have left over from the past? It also caused me to kind of think about some branches that I've left a little bit unexplored. Like right now I have kind of like weapons and shields. I have religion. I have the concept of sort of like solidarity. I have, but it made me realize it's like there's a handful of things that I haven't really explored that might be really interesting. One of them was law. There's no concept of law in the game, and I thought that would be like an interesting thing to explore. That what if you could explore law and actually introduce new rules or change rules or punish people for not following rules? That's an interesting thing. It also allows you to introduce like prison and chains and things like that. That was really interesting. And another huge one is I went to several art museums and I thought, of course, one of the main things left behind that tells us a lot about the past is art. And that's one of my favorite things to see when I travel around. So I would love to introduce the concept of art. I don't know yet game mechanically how it's going to work, but I'm like, thematically, it would just feel wrong to not have this in here. And then the other one was statues. So many good statues everywhere. And statues are this really interesting indicator or kind of tell of like what people cared about. Like, who did you make a statue of? Did you make a statue of a great military hero? Did you make a statue of your greatest writer? We found ourselves in like a park in the middle of Amsterdam, and it was like, here's our best writer. And you're like, oh, that's interesting. You go into the Pantheon in Paris, and it's like the people who they're celebrating the most is like, here's our great thinkers. Here's Voltaire. Like, that's really interesting. That's very different than highlighting a huge military hero. So I think I'm thinking more about statues too as a kind of like pinnacle thing of like, if there's a statue of somebody in the ancient city, that's a clear indicator that like that's what they cared about. So I think that's a really interesting angle. That's something I want to pursue a little bit more. So anyway, found a lot of inspiration from real life, and it made me just think about legibility, reality, grounding the player in something they're familiar with, so you can give them this immersive experience. And that's what I want to focus on a lot in the next phase of development.